Welcome everybody to the 43rd Cultural Majlis. My name is Sultan Saud Al-Qasmi. I'm joining you from Sharjah in the UAE, and it's my pleasure to be hosting our guest today, who is joining us from London in the UK. And to introduce her tonight, we have Sara Al-Ajmi, who's an acquaintance of mine as well. Sara is a Kuwaiti architect, and she's just graduated from Yale School of Architecture, and I had the pleasure of seeing some of her work there. Sara, thank you for doing this, and the mic is yours. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you, Sultan, for the lovely invitation. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here on Zoom to introduce tonight's Cultural Majlis guest speaker, Rana Al Mutawa. I had the pleasure of meeting Rana last year during a research trip to Dubai, where I remember we had extensive conversations on identity. Rana is an Emirati researcher and a current PhD candidate at Oxford University in Middle Eastern Studies, and her thesis is conducting an urban ethnography. Rana's research work is focused on topics of national identity, citizenship, ethnic diversity, and concepts of belonging in the Gulf. Her work challenges ideas about authenticity and seeks to understand meanings in urban spaces, as she has delineated in her published work on the malls of Dubai. Rana taught and conducted research for 3 years at Zayed University in Dubai. She was managing editor at Gulf Affairs in 2017 and 18, a journal based at St. Anthony's College at Oxford. With her talk titled Beyond Binaries of Fake Authentic, I am honored and pleased to present to you tonight's speaker, Rana Al Mutawa.
Thank you so much, Sara, for the introduction. Thank you, Sultan, for offering me this opportunity to speak here today. And thank you for everyone who's attending the talk. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. Okay. So before I begin the presentation, I'll just give a brief background about this research. So this research is part of my doctoral thesis. I've been conducting it over the past 3 years, and I've interviewed Emiratis and non-Emiratis who live in Dubai. And basically, most of my interlocutors are middle class and upper middle class individuals. So this research reflects the experiences of a certain segment of society, a certain perspective. But I'll also be including in the discussion top issues of class, for instance, or race, to help understand how everything fits together. So I'll begin this presentation with a trope that I think many people here may have heard. And that trope is that Dubai is superficial. And there are many issues with this type of comment. But for now, I want to talk about one of the responses that this comment provokes. And one of the responses is to say, well, you think that Dubai is superficial because you've only been to the malls. You haven't been to the old parts of the city. You haven't been to places like the one in this photo. You haven't been to the creek. But if you go there, you're going to see the culture and history of Dubai. And you're going to see that Dubai is not superficial. And while these types of comments are well-meaning and well-intentioned, they do promote a binary of a supposedly fake part of a city and a supposedly authentic part of a city, with the so-called fake or so-called glitzy part of the city understood as places such as shopping malls, new developments, upscale restaurants and coffee shops, chain restaurants, while the so-called authentic part of the city is understood as places such as the creek or the old parts of Dubai. And when we have these binaries of fake and authentic, we end up dismissing the social meanings that take place in these supposedly superficial places. And also we end up exoticizing or romanticizing the so-called authentic places. And this is what I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. So in the first section, I'll talk about the quest for authenticity and why it can be problematic. And in the second part of the presentation, I'll talk about the social meanings that take place in these supposedly artificial places, the memories that people have in them, the social contestations that take place there, the cultural negotiations that take place there, as well as, of course, the exclusions that happen in these privatized settings as well. Now, here in this part of the presentation where I talk about the quest for authenticity, I want to first emphasize that I'm not trying to define what authenticity is. And I say that because in other presentations, people have asked me to define authenticity or have asked me which parts of the city I consider to be authentic or not. And my response to that is, social scientists argue that authenticity is a social construct. So it's something we've constructed or kind of imagined. So there is no objectively authentic place for me to define. What I'm going to be doing instead is talking about some of my interviewees' ideas about authenticity. And then also, raising issue with some of these ideas. So for instance, some of my interviewees feel that Dubai is superficial because, they feel like it's been built in a top-down manner, that the inhabitants of the city don't participate in the decision-making of how the city is built. And of course, that's an important point because there are obviously people who feel a sense of loss. They feel like that the city has changed and they don't want it to change to that extent. And they feel alienated. And that's definitely an experience that's there, and it should be addressed and it should be recognized. But that's not the only legitimate experience. So there are other people, I think maybe a lot of people, who are kind of in this ambivalent position where they may feel alienated in one part of New Dubai, but completely at home in another part of New Dubai. Even though all of these developments may be globalized or top-down developments, but they have different relationships to different parts of this globalized, glitzy city. And I think it's important to recognize that. It's important to recognize that, yes, people may feel alienated, but they also can form connections and attachments and meanings even within these so-called glitzy developments. And I emphasize that because I think there's this, in some academic works, there's this focus on alienation to the extent that inhabitants almost come out as victims. And I'm not saying that there are no people who get excluded. In fact, there are definitely certain people who get excluded from the city, especially in terms of class. But I also think it's important to recognize that people have a variety of contradictory experiences, and they can manage to form connections and attachments even within these glitzy spaces. And that's actually something I'm going to be talking about more in the second section of the presentation. I'm going to be talking more about the connections and attachments people make in this supposedly glitzy city. And maybe in the question and answer session, we can talk more about this idea of top-down developments and the contradictory feelings people have, because there's a lot to say about it. But for now, I'll focus again on authenticity. And I also want to recognize here that when my interlocutors talk about the city being inauthentic, while I do find these labels problematic, I also want to acknowledge that sometimes they do raise important concerns. So for instance, some people feel that Dubai is superficial because it's too concerned with the glamorous. It's concerned with showing itself as a glitzy place, as a luxurious place. And in doing so, it is neglecting some parts of the city, the older parts of the city and the low-income parts of the city. And some of my interviewees have discussed this in relation to the politics of representation. So who is being represented and what places are being represented in the official advertising campaigns, in the official narratives, who is being represented. And so some of them, some academics, some researchers, some photographers, some artists are specifically focusing on Old Dubai in their work because of that. So they're focusing on it because they want to kind of make more central a place and maybe people who are in some ways on the periphery in terms of representation. And they want to centralize that. And I think that this is very important work, and I think this is very significant and very meaningful. But I think that there's also kind of this fine line where between that and between the type of work that focuses on Old Dubai to provide an alternative perspective or a counter narrative, but in doing so, it exoticizes and romanticizes these places as the real places, and the people who live in these places as the real people. And there are several examples of this. Some of them may kind of come off as subtle, but I think in general, they kind of basically have the same idea of this is the authentic place and the rest is superficial. And I think that this quest for authenticity and the exoticization that results out of it, it happens in many different settings. So there are some great examples from the US. And I'll talk about one of these examples. John Paul Brammer, who is a Mexican-American journalist, wrote a few articles about authenticity. And he talked about Americans' ideas of what supposedly authentic Mexican culture is like. And he says that for them, most of their ideas revolve around, kind of struggle or pain. So they associate authentic Mexican culture with struggle or pain. And when they ask him for recommendations for authentic Mexican restaurants, for instance, he says that for them, most of the hallmarks seem to be about pain. Dirty floors, plastic chairs, anything that aesthetically connotes struggle. The cooks and waiters ought to have accents. There should probably be a framed photo of someone's dead grandpa. If the joint has no air conditioning, if it's off the beaten path, if the voyeur has to work to find it, then the experience is supposedly richer for it. It makes the voyeur better, more worldly for having brushed up against it. So I think that this is a really great example of how the quest for authenticity, can be voyeuristic. It's exoticizing certain places and people and kind of placing them in a box. In this case, it's voyeuristic because you have, high-income people or middle-class people going to low-income neighborhoods so that they can observe and enjoy the aesthetics of poverty, which they consider to be authentic, without themselves having to experience the negative consequences of that. So in his description, there's also this kind of poverty fetishism that goes on. And, sometimes it doesn't seem as dramatic. You may hear people going to, the creek in Dubai because they feel like it's a simple place and they're reminded, of their childhood. And, that's completely fine. But I think that sometimes there are other connections that relate to exoticizing these places. You may hear about people going to a restaurant in Satwa and kind of pointing to the same things that Bramer described. The plastic chairs, maybe the waiters don't speak English very well. And then, they might say that this is what makes that place authentic. And in doing so, there's sometimes this aspect of exoticizing that place. And also perhaps dismissing other places, maybe globalized places like shopping malls as inauthentic. And in doing so, also dismissing the realities, the memories, the forms of belonging that take place also in these globalized settings. So I think these are some of the issues that come up with the quest for authenticity. Another thing is that, the quest for authenticity is not always just this pure intention to, find a simple life without consumption. It's also sometimes a quest for social distinction. So as Bramer says, the voyeur feels better about themselves when they, supposedly discover this authentic place. They feel more worldly or more cosmopolitan. They maybe feel different from the so-called masses or different from a so-called typical tourist. So it can also be a quest for social distinction. There are so many other things about authenticity that I'd love to talk about. Such as, how sometimes they're related to racist stereotypes, as we can see in this quote here, and how they can also be Orientalist. But I'll leave you to read this quote if you'd like. Just because of time, I won't be discussing it now, but maybe we can talk about it in the question and answer session. What I want to do now is to move on to the next section of the presentation, where I talk about these so-called superficial places and the social meanings that take place there. So these places, shopping malls, chain restaurants, new developments, places like Starbucks, these are considered to be, by some people, superficial places. Especially, if they're globalized, people feel like these places exist everywhere. You go to a shopping mall anywhere in the world and then you find the same shops there, the same chain restaurants and chain shops. So they find them to be non-places. They feel like, they can be found anywhere and they don't have any culture. And when we view places in this manner, we can't see then the cultural negotiations that take place there, that these are actually important cultural sites, which I'll talk about later, that these are actually important spaces for belonging, that these are actually important places for forming memories, for instance. And when I say that these are significant spaces, when I talk about how these are important spaces and where people form belonging, this does not mean that these are ideal spaces or that these are ideal public spaces. And I say this because I also don't want to, kind of romanticize these places as well. The reality is that these places are also privatized spaces. So they're built to generate profit. And so exclusions will take place there. Now, these places that people consider to be superficial can vary from a shopping mall to a 5-star hotel. And they're very different in terms of their clientele and the way people use them. So the hotel is usually much more exclusive than a shopping mall, for instance. And in some of the big shopping malls in Dubai, let's say Dubai Mall, you do see some diversity there. You do see people of different national and ethnic backgrounds, and also difference in socioeconomic backgrounds. Although again, this does not mean that that all people are included in these spaces. So for instance, shopping malls all over the world, not just in the Gulf, have security guards. And security guards stop certain people from entering. And the people they stop are usually, stigmatized groups that people assume may cause trouble, even if they don't cause any trouble. And these are usually not wealthy people. Usually these are low-income people. And so that's an example of the exclusions that take place in these privatized settings. Another issue is that there are indirect exclusions that also take place in these settings. So for instance, some people may not feel comfortable in these places because they feel like, they're very fancy and they don't fit in there, that they have to be dressed in a certain way, that, they're different from other people there and they don't feel comfortable. And so that's another type of exclusion that can take place in these, kind of glitzy or privatized settings. And I think that we can acknowledge these and criticize these exclusions, and we can seek more inclusive spaces, and we can search for alternatives, and we should do that. And I think we can do that without having to entirely dismiss these spaces, without having to, kind of just say that, well, they're just more of the same, and they're just spaces of consumption. And so what I'll be doing in the rest of the presentation is talking about the social meanings that people have in these places. And one of the first things I want to talk about is people's memories there. People's memories in places like shopping malls. And I think it's interesting to talk about these memories because when you talk to people in the Gulf, you will hear certain types of memories. So you will hear a lot of people talking about, their memories in the simple days. They'll talk about their memories walking to the neighborhood Dikkan, which is the bodega, or their memories playing with their neighbors in the Farij, which is the neighborhood. And these are very important memories because, they also represent a life that's changed. Even if these places still exist, they've radically changed. And people feel a sense of loss. They feel like they've lost that simple life. And that's very important. And, that should be acknowledged. But also, I think it's important to recognize that people may have similar forms of nostalgia or wistfulness, even to a place like a shopping mall. And the example I'm going to give here is by a social media influencer who wrote about his memories going to Deira City Center after not having been there in a long time. And Deira City Center is a mall that was very popular in the 1990s by people who lived in different areas of Dubai and also outside of Dubai. And it still exists and it's still used by a lot of people who live in Deira, but a lot of people who used to go there don't go there anymore. And so when they go there, they kind of get these flashbacks and memories of that place and their childhood memories or their teenage memories. And this post is one example of that. So if you can read the post in Arabic, I think it reads way better in Arabic, but I'll read the version I've translated in English. And he says, in Deira City Center, recalling memories and days that are gone, when it used to be the most important mall and the most popular, a strange feeling with some sadness and a lot of longing. And I think that this is a really good example of how people can have these bittersweet memories, these feelings of nostalgia, this longing, even to a place like a big shopping mall. And a lot of people I interviewed did have their memories in these places. Some of them had their memories in places like Gharer Center, which is even older than Deira City Center. So one of my interviewees remembered that he would get really dressed up to go to Gharer Center on the weekends because he said that Dubai was a small town at that time and everyone, you would find all of Dubai there on the weekends. And he would get really dressed up to go there and he would, bump into a lot of people there. And that's actually another, in my opinion, an important social function of a mall. The mall as a place where people kind of go to bump into other members of society and also a place to see and to be seen. And that's something I want to focus on here, the malls as places to see and to be seen. Now, in this section of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing more on my Emirati interviewees, just because the places I look at, like City Walk or these places, certain places in Dubai malls, such as the one you see in this photo, have a lot of Emirati users. But in reality, seeing and being seen happens among different segments of society, and it happens in different ways. So for instance, Katie Walsh, who's a British researcher, she talked about how young British singles in Dubai go to specifically British-dominated bars and nightclubs, and not the cosmopolitan ones, but the British-dominated ones, because they want to kind of be around a specific segment of society. And part of that entails wanting to see and to be seen. So I think it happens among different people, it just manifests in different ways. But anyway, I'll be focusing on my Emirati interviewees. And I also want to point out that some of my interviewees really didn't like going to these places. Some of them felt like, they're uncomfortable in them, that they're watched in them, that they're stared at, that there's gonna be a lot of gossip, that they have to be dressed in a certain way, that they have to get really dressed up to go there. And so they didn't like these places. They didn't enjoy them. They didn't, feel comfortable in them. However, I think it's also important to recognize that some people do enjoy these places and these practices. And I think we need to recognize that, because I also hear these places kind of considered as trivial by some people. So I do hear a lot of people saying, well, the people who go to malls, to kind of see and to be seen, they're trivial. They don't have anything to do with their lives, so they're just wasting it in a mall. They're just there to show off their handbag or their car or their watch. They're not, actually having a friendly encounters with other people. They're just staring at them and gossiping about them. It's not very friendly. And while I understand some of these concerns, I think if we judge these places in that manner, we won't be able to see why they're meaningful to other people. And I think one of the reasons that they're meaningful is maybe these places are ones where people go so that they can experience, in a way, belonging to a subgroup of society. And another thing we don't see is that these practices actually may happen in many other different settings all over the world, but they just manifest in different ways. So, for instance, if we think about places like academic conferences or cultural events or cultural talks, not just in the Gulf, but all over the world. Yes, people go to these places to listen to a lecture or to, get new information or to get new academic content, but they also may go to these places to network. They go to these places because they kind of want to show themselves. They want to show face. They want to see and to be seen. They want to be recognized as part of that academic community or cultural community. Sometimes, they might want to keep up to date with what's going on. And when I say keep up to date, I don't mean just keeping up to date with the academic information, but kind of keep up to date with who's who and who's there and what are they doing. And I say that because I think definitely places like academic conferences have these practices and have that gossip. Again, everywhere, not just in the Gulf. And so I think that it's important to make these comparisons just so that we don't dismiss these practices when they happen in malls as superficial or trivial, when in reality, I think there are ways for some people to maybe feel belonging to a sub-segment of society. Another thing is that these performances of distinction that happen in malls, this showing off that people criticize, I think it also happens in places like academic events and cultural events. So, in informal conversations, you might find people who want to show how knowledgeable they are about something or how culturally or politically aware they are. And so this performance of distinction or this showing off, it just manifests in different ways in other places, but it exists almost everywhere. And to kind of just then point to the malls and the people in these malls as people who are there to show off and trivial, that just kind of ignores that these practices happen in many other different settings. And there are ways for people to maybe feel as legitimate members of a group or to distinguish themselves. And I think these comparisons can allow us to see these places in kind of less black and white ways. Now, another thing about seeing and being seen that I think is very important is that sometimes these shopping malls or these coffee shops, they become kind of these stages where different members of society cross and encounter each other. And so in some ways they become sort of public spaces. And again, as I mentioned before, these are not entirely public spaces because not all segments of society can be found there. There are exclusions. There are people who are not kind of welcome in these spaces to an extent. But I think there's still some diversity that takes place in these settings. And I think that's important because as some scholars have noted, it's allowing for kind of some sorts of debate to happen. So for instance, Laure Assaf, who's a professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, she wrote an article about shopping malls in the Gulf, and she gave an example of a Twitter campaign that was created by 2 Emirati women, and the campaign was about modest dress codes. And they started this campaign after they saw women dressed in very skimpy outfits at the mall. And you know, for some people, this might kind of raise some negative connotations that, you know, there's this conflict that's arising out of these encounters, that maybe, you know, there are restrictions on, there are some people who are pushing for restrictions on women's dress. But I think her argument is that these debates are taking place. Maybe they're not taking place in a mall, they're taking place in another setting, but these malls are allowing these debates to be ignited. They're allowing people to think of them and debate them because of these encounters that happen in a mall. And so that makes these spaces very important. They're important places for social contestations and for cultural negotiations. And I think that these social contestations, we can actually see them very often. We hear about them very often, but sometimes we don't necessarily recognize them as such. So I think we often hear people saying, well, I went to the mall and I saw this, and they describe a behavior they observed. And it may appear to be trivial, or it may appear to be gossipy. And I have some quotes here from Twitter that I've translated to give examples of what I mean. And so these may appear to be kind of trivial examples, but I think they kind of represent how people of different backgrounds, people who have different ideas about gender norms, people who have different ideas about social norms, people who have different ideas about modesty are crossing and encountering each other in these places. And that makes them important cultural sites. It makes them important spaces for social contestations. And, you know, the examples I've given here are mostly about, you know, kind of the conflicts that arise or the tensions that arise. But I think that these places are also allowing, you know, people to challenge social norms, and therefore for some social norms to become normalized, for some social norms to be contested. So a lot of the women I interviewed, Emirati women, Arab women, South Asian women, especially women from more conservative families, they said that when malls first started opening in Dubai, it was not considered very appropriate for a young woman to go there alone or to go there with female friends. And they say that this has changed a lot over time. And of course, there are many reasons for why this has changed. But I think one of the reasons is simply that more and more women were seen in these public spaces. And so it became more normalized. Another example is about the wearing a colored abaya rather than a black abaya. Again, these examples may appear to be trivial, they may appear to be small, but actually in reality, wearing a colored abaya is considered taboo by some families. It's considered a transgression of social norms. And so it's actually, it's become, I think, more normalized over time. And I think one reason it got normalized is just more and more women started wearing these clothes in places like shopping malls, in places like coffee shops. And, you know, there may have been gossip about these women. There may have been people criticizing them for transgressing social norms. And that's part of the social contestations that are taking place. And over time, things have become more normalized as more and more women were seen in these places. And so that means that these places are actually very important cultural sites because they're important places for social contestations and cultural negotiations. And when we think of old Dubai as a place where culture happens or where there's culture, then we're also dismissing the reality that these shopping malls or these developments are very important cultural sites. And, you know, I'll end with that. And I'll say that, you know, or I'll ask, what other things might we be missing out on? What other realities might we be missing out on when we are using these labels of authentic or fake? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana, I invite everyone to send their questions via text that you can type in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you as long as you ask a question and not make a statement. If it's a short statement, that's also okay. But I think I'll take a question from the chat. Bill Bragan from NYU Abu Dhabi says he was having a conversation earlier today about gentrification in New York, and as you described, the feeling of loss of the old places that made it real, and how there are parallels to the sense of urban flux in the UAE. The question of authenticity seems to be related to this scene of old things that used to be there. I'm curious what your point of view of gentrification is and what that means in the local context.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, there are several points to that question. One of them, of course, is that, you know, there are people, low-income people, particularly as maybe some places get gentrified, who may not find a place or kind of comfort in the newer parts of the city. So that's one issue of gentrification that exists in all these different places. But then I guess you're asking about this kind of sense of loss and the real and the authentic. And I mean, there's definitely a sense of loss. There are definitely people who feel alienated. And, you know, I think that it is obviously important to preserve some of the older parts of the city, some of the, you know, places that people have connections to and attachments to. I think that's very important. But I do think that, you know, this means different things to different people, because I do hear a lot of people saying, oh, we really miss the simple days when we used to go to the park and it was very simple. And, you know, we would just go there and play and we didn't care about what we looked like and all of these things. But, you know, the park, it would actually still be there. It would still be in their neighborhood. They would still be living next to it, but they just don't go there anymore. And so when they say that they miss this simple life, and these places that they miss still exist, I wonder why they don't engage with these spaces anymore, because these places themselves haven't changed. So I think there are other things. Yes, the city is changing, and yes, it's gentrifying, and these are major issues, but I think that we also need to kind of question, why are people missing that simple life that they want, but then not actually engaging with these spaces? Is it because, you know, it's just more socially acceptable among some classes now to go to specific places? Is that why? I think these are other questions that maybe we can think of.
Okay, I have a question from Saud Al-Marzougi. Saud, would you like to ask your question? Go ahead. And you need to unmute yourself as well. Saud, go ahead, Saud.
Okay, thank you so much, Sultan. يعطيك العافية, Rana, on the talk. I asked a question in the chat earlier. Would you say Emiratis have a tendency of being seen and to see partially as a legacy of, you know, some historic aspects of our community, of being connected or being collective, or like, you know, that small community feel, that everyone's trying to know what everyone's up to, trying, you know, to stay connected. Do you think that has, I don't know if my question makes sense, if it has moved with time and has transformed and became a factor of this, as we see in the malls, of this tendency, especially with the Emiratis, to, you know, to be seen and to see?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think that these practices of seeing and being seen do happen in many different types of settings. But yes, I mean, they do happen, and you do hear more Khalijis talking about this. That, you know, we went to this place and we felt uncomfortable, and I have experienced this myself. Going to certain places, I do feel more watched, and it may be relating to some kind of aspects that you described. So actually, I was in a wedding once, and I was speaking to my aunt, and I was telling her, you know, there are people who love going to weddings a few times a month, or, you know, even a few times a week. And do you think they enjoy going there? because it takes a lot of time to get dressed up, and it's a kind of a long process to go to a wedding. And she said, yes, of course they like going to weddings, because it's like opening a newspaper. And so what she's saying is that these social events are ways for people to kind of catch up or kind of know what's going on. Maybe there's gossip, maybe there's actually closer people that you're speaking to, maybe there are people you don't know as much, but there are ways to kind of know what's going on in a community, kind of keep up to date. And so, yes, I do see that aspect in Gulf society, but also I don't want to say that this is just a thing that happens in Gulf societies, because in the examples I gave in the presentation, such as, in the academic conferences and the cultural talks all over the world, you do have these types of kind of wanting to see and recognize and wanting to see what's going on. So I do think it happens in different settings, it just manifests in different ways.
Thank you, Rana. I have Rawan Makki next. Go ahead, Rawan.
Thank you, Sultan, and thank you so much, Rana. Really insightful talks. You mentioned social inclusivity a lot during your talk, and you had this very kind of hyper awareness of this kind of dimension of space. So I just wanted to ask kind of, what kind of things in your research have you come up across that could, improve social inclusivity, or maybe even in areas beyond the mall or within the mall. So I guess any thoughts on kind of the path forward when it comes to that, because I think you're right, that is one of the criticisms, and people tend to kind of overly focus on that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Rawan. I think that, a solution to this type of issue probably requires a lot of different people, so urban planners and maybe anthropologists and a lot of different people working together. And I say that because I think that, just having a park, like a public park, is maybe not enough. And I say this because, for instance, in Gulf countries, you have just the demographics of these states is that there is a very high percentage of men, much more than women. And so it doesn't kind of, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but when you go to certain places and there are a lot of men, I think that's already kind of like, how are you going to kind of work with that gender dimension? Now, I think there are other issues, which is the dimension of race and class, which is that some men who are of specific race and ethnic backgrounds and class backgrounds will be stigmatized as kind of supposedly more dangerous than other people. And so then how do you work with that? Because I don't think it's enough to have a public park. I think you need more than that to kind of work with these things. And again, I think that these are issues that exist everywhere. They just manifest in different ways. So the stigmatization of men of specific ethnic backgrounds and class backgrounds, and viewing them as more dangerous, that's also an issue in countries all over the world. So I feel like there are so many structural issues that, having a public place, I don't know if it's enough. Yeah. Sorry, I know that's not an answer, but
no, it's great. Thank you so much. It's very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. I have a question coming in from Mohammed Abul Al, but the chat is just so interesting. There's a question from Lubna. Mohammed, I'm sorry, I just want to take this question from Lubna. She says, you mentioned earlier how the search for authenticity can be voyeuristic. Is there a way to immerse oneself in a different culture without coming off as insensitive or voyeuristic?
Yeah, I wish I could answer this question because I feel like I struggle with it myself, and I feel like if I go to another place, or even when I want to learn about my own society and I want to know about things I don't really know about, I feel like I kind of struggle with that. Am I interested in this thing because it seems more authentic? How do the other people feel about me wanting to learn about these things? What stereotypes or what ideas am I coming with? So unfortunately, I don't have an answer. I have a lot of questions, and I think maybe just having these questions is one way to go about this.
Okay, we have Mohammed Abul Al and then Scott Eric. So go ahead, Mohammed.
Thank you, Saud. My question was related to the difference between authentic locations and, oh sorry, Sultan Saud, my mistake. The difference between authentic places and inauthentic places. And the idea was, what are the metrics that we use to ascertain whether something is authentic or inauthentic, fake or not fake. So I thought perhaps we might be able to assess that based on the outlets that are there. So you can see who the mall is targeting based on what the outlets are. So for example, in that example of the mall that was, the previously very popular mall, perhaps there you would find certain outlets that target certain individuals, and therefore that is a quote unquote more authentic mall. Whereas the newer malls that have a wider array of outlets and is now targeting a wider array of people is now in a more inauthentic mall. So I want to see what Rana in particular thinks about this and what the panel in general thinks about this.
So my thoughts on this are that, as I mentioned in the presentation, that because authenticity is a social construct and it's something that we kind of, we create, I can't say that there is an objectively authentic place or not. And I think that is important. That it's important to go to places and not have this idea that this is authentic or not authentic, but rather to go to a place, however supposedly inauthentic it might be, and kind of think, how do people in this city, what are their relationships to this place? How do they interact with this place? What are the, the social contestations that are taking place there? What were people's reactions to these places? Are they critical of them? Has that changed over time? And I think when we go with these questions, that's when we actually know about that place and understand it, rather than kind of just label it as authentic or not.
Thank you. We have Scott Erich and then Laure. Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, Sultan. And thank you, Rana, for this excellent talk. Your research strikes me as being against some of the sort of unvarnished discussions of progress and the spectacle of modernity. And that being said, I think also the discourse around authenticity is so tied to conceptions of non-modern and modern. So I'm wondering if your research ties in with anachronism, notions of modernity, or like a teleology of progress in a way that the authenticity is necessarily tied to that. For example, when someone looks at a souk versus the mall or something like that.
Yeah. So I haven't explored this much in my own work because I've looked at other aspects, but definitely this idea that, a souk is more authentic than a mall, it came up, and I think it's related to this idea that globalized places can't be authentic because, they're non-places, they exist everywhere and they're the same everywhere. But I think actually John Paul Brammer wrote in his articles, spoke about this really in very interesting ways, because he gave an example of the tacos in Mexican restaurants. And he said that there is a specific kind of taco, and I don't really know where it is in the US, but he says there is a specific kind of taco that uses Parmesan cheese. And that for some people is considered inauthentic because Parmesan cheese, supposedly shouldn't be used in Mexican cuisine. But he says that the reason it's used in that state is because there are a lot of Italians there, and they didn't have access to the other types of cheese, and so they use what's there, and that is kind of the natural progression of how the tacos were created. But he says that it's also kind of, this type of taco is threatened in terms of being there is a risk that it might be wiped out because people don't view it as authentic. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at it, because it shows that, yes, people have these ideas of authenticity, it shouldn't be modern, it should be the old souk, but I think he's kind of showing how these modern or kind of newer inventions have their own history as well.
Thank you so much, Rana. We have Laure next.
Thank you very much, Rana, for this talk. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk and to see your research evolve. I thought that you did a very good job of highlighting how shopping malls are places of encounter with the diversity of the population in a city like Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And when you can encounter this diversity in a very different way than going to the creek or sort of exoticizing these other spaces. I have a question that's a bit sort of on the side of what you've presented today. when you were talking about shopping malls are places where social norms are made or unmade or questions are negotiated, etc. Many of the examples that you used were taken from Twitter. And I was wondering how much, the internet is sort of, or social media are sometimes thought of as these echo chambers of many of the things that are happening in social life. And I was wondering how much of this specific quality to these spaces that you're talking about, how much of this nostalgia, how much of the quality of malls as social spaces is also built through narratives that are built on these social media, how the communities that are encountering in these places, even if they don't necessarily meet in the mall or interact with each other or encounter inside these spaces, are actually encountering on these other spaces that are Twitter, that are Facebook, where they do express this common nostalgia for these spaces.
Sorry, just to make sure I understood your question, are you asking to what extent the people who are in shopping malls, who are maybe not interacting in these shopping malls, end up interacting in these social media sites, or was it something else?
Yeah, basically how the narratives around these spaces that are shared on social media also creates forms of community that might connect people in another way.
Yeah. So, definitely when I was searching for these tweets and looking for a social media post, you do see, so there was actually this instance of, I don't know if people here have heard of it, but there was this, I can't remember where, but it was in a place in the Gulf where someone was protesting or like posting on social media that they found a poster of in MAC Cosmetics of a man advertising a lipstick, and they were saying that, well, this is really inappropriate. Why is a man advertising a lipstick? This is against our culture and traditions and so on. And they posted it on Snapchat. And then so many people reacted to this. I mean, there were people who were kind of disagreeing, but I think a lot of people, because again of this, maybe as you said, the echo chamber, a lot of people agreeing with this, and at the end of the day, they actually removed the posters from the mall because of this attention it got from Snapchat. Now, I don't think that everyone kind of uses it in the same way, so you do see a lot of people kind of venting on Twitter without really anyone responding to them or anyone engaging with them. But yeah, it can be used in these variety of ways, and it can actually create changes in the mall itself as well.
Thank you, Rana. Next we have Hitan Samtani, and then we have Andrew Gardner. Go ahead, Hitan.
Thanks, Sultan. Thank you, Rana, for doing this. Just a question about how malls traditionally in Dubai have been used as a space of courtship and romance. And I wonder, with the availability of different kinds of public spaces now, as well as dating apps in the UAE, how that has changed. I wonder if any of your participants talked about that at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of people said that it has decreased, but it's still there, but it has decreased. And I don't know if that's about social media, or also, there were these harassment laws, so it might have decreased because of different reasons. But yes, I think definitely the mall is a place where people go for courtship is something that still exists. And I do hear people saying that they do use social media for that, so they might share their Snapchat username instead of their number or something like that. But yeah, I think that's also a very important point, because one thing I also hear about people criticizing the malls and criticizing the people who go there for courtship is that, again, these are trivial people, they don't have anything to do, and, they're silly. And, of course, this can be problematic because it can turn to harassment. That's definitely a concern. But I think for some people, especially maybe if there are no other means, now, as you mentioned, now there's social media, but if there are no other means to kind of meet someone of the opposite gender, then these malls are kind of actually important sites to do that. Again, so that also kind of makes them important sites for social contestations, and maybe in some ways transgressing social norms, but in ways that have become almost acceptable in some manner.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Andrew Gardner.
Rana, so wonderful for me to hear your presentation, a presentation from you for the first time, and I've been filling up the comment box with a variety of observations. One of my questions for you is I think this is a great point, that humans and in cities can invest in all sorts of different spaces, and that we often lose sight of this. And I think that's a wonderful point to make. I think about my own childhood, when me and my friends in the neighborhood, you know, we colonized the trash heap in our neighborhood and turned this into this wonderful and meaningful space. But my concern, and this is where my question is, does that inhibit our ability to critique and discern between good and bad public spaces? And does it also inhibit our ability to, say, following Mike Davis, to critique the ongoing dissolution of actual public spaces and the private sort of colonization of quasi-public space as well? I'm wondering how your point fits with these broader critiques, to which I have quite a bit of allegiance.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. So I've actually really thought about this a lot, and sometimes I kind of struggle with it. How do I talk about the mall as this important social space, which I do think it is for some people, but also realize that it's not this, ideal public space. And I guess, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that even the most idealized public spaces have been exclusive. I mean, this is something that scholars have argued, that even the most idealized public spaces are exclusive. And I think that maybe allows us to see these places in a less kind of black and white manner. And that's one thing that I'm looking at. But also, this does not mean that it's okay to have exclusive public spaces. That's not, that just because other places are exclusive, that does not mean it's, okay to have our social interactions only be in privatized spaces. And I think that, I don't know, I'm basically trying to kind of balance these two together, trying to acknowledge the restrictions, and also acknowledge that forms of belonging are also built on exclusion sometimes. So for instance, it's okay. So basically, there are some scholars who talked about in Egypt, they were giving examples from Egypt, and they talked about the upscale coffee shops there, and they talked about the upper middle class women, well, also men who use these places, but a lot of women also use them. And the reason that they use them and they feel comfortable there is exactly because of these exclusions, because the kind of main place, the street, these public places are uncomfortable for them, or they might face harassment, or for whatever reasons. The exclusivity also brings a sense of belonging, and I guess that's something that perhaps exists in many different settings. And I think what I'm basically trying to do is acknowledge that these forms of belonging are also created through exclusions in some ways. Another thing is that, I do focus on these places because I think that there is almost this kind of cultural elitism that that people have about them. And I think that's also kind of, an exclusivity of its own way, kind of in the academic sphere, or in these intellectual circles, where we're dismissing certain places and people. And I think we can recognize the exclusivity of these very places we critique without engaging in these culturally elitist stereotypes. And I think that's one reason why I feel like it's important to acknowledge the meanings that take place in these settings.
Thank you, Rana. We have a couple of more questions coming before we wrap up for today. The next one is from Emel. Emel, go ahead.
Thanks, Sultan. Hi, Rana. I have two questions. So the first question is, you talked about earlier in your presentation about interviewing some people, and you've mentioned that some people are feeling alienated or connected to the city. So can you talk a little bit about who those people are? Are they Emiratis? Are they expats? Are they visitors? I think it's important, to know the perspective of who you're talking about, especially when you're talking about a diverse city like Dubai. And the other question is, or maybe this is more of a critique, but I think it's hard to dismiss a definition of authenticity here, because I mean, what makes the glamorous buildings like the Burj Khalifa, for example, less authentic than the buildings along the Dubai Creek? Is it because they lack memory? Is it because they lack an Emirati presence? Is the Dubai Creek today less authentic because it lacks public space for everyone? Does it lack architecture that responds to the region? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, if you have any on that. Thank you.
Okay. So the first part about who I've spoken to. So my interviewees are Emiratis and non-Emiratis who have lived in the UAE for a very long time, so at least 20 years. And most of them, or a lot of them, are born and raised in the UAE. And I specifically chose non-citizens who have a connection with the city to understand their experiences of the changing city. And I think that the feelings of alienation are not specific to a specific nationality or a specific age group. Although maybe I do find it more among older people, but I don't think it's specific to older people. So you do have young Arabs who are not Emiratis who feel a sense of loss because the places they on the beach have changed, the places they used to go to on the beach have changed, the creek has changed, so they feel that sense of loss. And similarly, you also have Emiratis who feel a sense of alienation. But maybe sometimes it's also a bit different, different types of alienation. So for instance, you do hear some Emiratis saying, well, the city has now a lot of, not all of them, but some of them feel like that, the city has a lot of foreigners. We don't see any Emiratis. So that's kind of one critique. But I should also say that some of my non-Emirati interviewees have also made similar comments where they say, well, we feel alienated because the city seems like it's built for outsiders or it's built for Westerners. And so, these are kind of in some ways similar critiques. Now, I think that, sorry, can you tell me about your second question?
Sure. Yeah, so the question was more about, maybe more of a critique, but what I was saying is that it's hard to dismiss a definition of authenticity because, what makes the so-called glamorous buildings less authentic than the buildings along the creek, for example, like today, like do they lack memory? Do they, don't represent, is there no Emirati presence in those areas? Does the Dubai Creek have less or lack of public space for everyone? Is it because the architecture doesn't respond to the place it resides in? So yeah.
Okay, so my answer to this question also connects to the first question, which is that, when we think of these kind of newer places as inauthentic, let's say, the restaurants at the IFC, for instance, like Zuma and these type of upscale places, which are exclusive and which do, a lot of people don't feel comfortable in them. For me, I think it's important to go beyond the labels of authenticity or inauthenticity because I think using these labels does not allow us to see the different ways people interact with these places. And one of the ways that people interact with these places, or for instance, even let's talk about specifically Emiratis. So I would say that maybe when these types of restaurants, the ones that kind of have serve alcohol or the ones that you find in hotels, when they first opened, I think it was also less comfortable for some people to go there, or it wasn't considered an appropriate place for some Emirati families. And it still isn't for some people, but I think that has also changed. And some of these places, you actually do see a lot of Emiratis there, and it started to become also a place in a way for some Emiratis to be seen. So it starts to have its own, with time, it starts to kind of have its own culture in some ways. It has its own, character. So I think that if we use these labels of authentic or not, we're not going to be able to see that. Another thing is that, in terms of feeling alienated, some people I've spoken to, they talked about how, again, the city is built for foreigners and Westerners, and they feel like it's not built for them as Emiratis. But this very same people would actually go to specifically Western dominated hotels or coffee shops, because they feel like these places are classier, or they feel like when I go there, I'm not in Dubai anymore. I feel like I'm in Europe. And so these contradictory attitudes and these complex attitudes, I think they're important. And when we're, thinking just, again, authentic or superficial, we're not able to see these complexities.
Rana, my last question is to wrap up. You've been doing this for a number of years. Can you share with us like one or two stories of what people's reactions are when you go and ask them about malls? I mean, are they surprised that someone is asking them about a mall and what a mall means for them? Do they consider that, or do they say, we just come here to shop and hang out? Maybe you have a story, maybe someone was happy or unhappy.
Yeah, I think that, I think that the thing that stuck most with me was that when I tell people that I'm doing my research on these ideas of authenticity and superficiality, is they kind of say the same thing I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. They say, oh yeah, foreigners think that Dubai is superficial because they haven't been to the old Dubai. You should take them there and then they'll know that it's not superficial. And I guess the surprising thing for me is that these very people who say that don't go to the creek, they don't go to Old Dubai, they don't buy their spices from there. They don't actually interact much with these places. And so I think even within the people who have these meanings in places like shopping malls or coffee shops, I feel like there's such a dominant idea that these are non-places, that even though they use them, and they do establish meanings there, they may not recognize that. And I just want to expand on this a bit, because I saw a comment which mentioned that people in these spaces don't really interact with each other. They may be there to see and to be seen, but they don't interact. And I think that is true to some extent. And I think also seeing and being seen, even without interacting, is a form of socializing in itself. But also I want to mention an article that was published in one of the local newspapers. It was written by Rima Al-Kamali, and she was talking about Bin Sogat Mall. And she was talking about it as this place where you see, when you go there, you see people that you used to see in the newspapers in the 80s and 90s. These people who were in newspapers, you see them in the mall, and they're always there interacting with each other, and you feel a sense of community. So I think that there are many other experiences of actual encounters and interactions where people go and kind of act like they're almost in a majlis. And I say this because I have actually, which was was a very awkward interaction, but I've actually went to a group of men sitting in a mall that's close to my house, and I sat with them because I wanted to ask them questions, and I wanted to see them because I wanted to speak to them because I see them there every day, and I know they're there every day. And when I sat with them, they actually had, they didn't have they hadn't ordered anything. There was just a bottle of water, and they had their own dates from home. They would bring their own food basically from home and place it on the table. And I think these are the types of, interactions that we're not maybe paying attention to.
Rana Al Mutawa, thank you so much. Thanks to Sarah Al-Ajmi for her help in introducing. Thank you all for joining us. Have a lovely day wherever you are. Have a good night. All the best.
Thank you.